Hey guys, we have finally made it to His Dark Materials episode 8, Betrayal. This was the season finale, and as far as I'm concerned, it certainly did not disappoint. I'm going to go ahead and give this episode an A. It had everything that I wanted, it had everything that I needed, and it had a few extra things that I thought really added to what was happening. This was a great episode in terms of all of the tying up of loose ends that it had. We got to see most of the characters in the TV show, and I think it really gave us a lot of food for thought as we wait for season 2 to start, and some bigger ideas that I think really contribute to the show's overarching theme and any meaning we can derive from it. This episode started with two great portraits of both Mrs. Coulter and Lord Asriel. We see Mrs. Coulter with all of the Magisterium soldiers around her, preparing to attack Lord Asriel, and Mrs. Coulter herself is loading a gun. This is really Mrs. Coulter's position in the world at the moment. She is this figure of Magisterium might and violence, and it really is a role that she's embraced. On the other end of the spectrum, Lord Asriel is in his lab, and he is looking out a window to a mountain in the not so far distance. We can see the Aurora Borealis, the northern lights, shining over everything, and surrounding him are the mathematical equations he's written on the glass. He's a man of science, he's a man of exploration, he is someone who's very curious. His demon Stelmaria says, "It's time," and he says, "I know." Something big is about to happen, and everything that Lord Asriel has been preparing all this time, all these 7 episodes, is taking place imminently. We see Lyra and Pan poking around Asriel's lab, and when he finally takes notice of Lyra, Lord Asriel asks her, how is it that she came to be protected by the king of the Panzerbjorn, Yorick Byrnison? She says it's quite a story, completely dodging his question, skipping over all of the insane details for some reason. And Asriel doesn't accept that. He says, "That's not an answer, and I don't remember inviting you here." Lyra eventually says, "You don't want me? I came all of this way and you don't want me?" Now it's Asriel's turn to dodge the question, and he says, "I left you in a safe place. I left you at Jordan where I thought everything would be okay, you would be taken care of, and now you're here." Lyra asks why Asriel lied to her about being her father all of these years, and says that she would have been so proud to be his daughter. He seems kind of taken aback by this comment and says, "Why would you have been proud?" And she says, "You're Lord Asriel." Lord Asriel also asks her if Lyra knows who her mother is, and Lyra's response is, "Your choice in women is almost as bad as your choice in bears," and the two of them share a quick little laugh. Just as it seems like they're getting somewhere in their conversation, Asriel breaks off the conversation and says, "I'm breaking this off. This is getting sentimental, and I don't really want to continue this." He sees that Lyra is either crying or about to cry, and he says, "Lyra Belacqua, stop crying, you're stronger than that." And Lyra takes that moment to tell her father that she is not Lyra Belacqua anymore, she now goes by Lyra Silvertongue. She mentions that she was given this name by someone who truly loves her. This is when we can finally see some of her resentment boiling over. She gives Lord Asriel the alethiometer and says, "Here you are, I rescued Roger, I delivered the alethiometer, now I can go back home." Asriel looks at the alethiometer, and then he tells her that he doesn't actually need it. She's very surprised by this, and she says, "You don't need it. I came all this way. The master of Jordan College gave it to me." And Asriel points out that the master of Jordan College never really told her to take the alethiometer to Asriel. He might have talked around that point, but it wasn't that direct. It was just Lyra's interpretation of what the master said. Lyra tells Asriel all of the things that she had to do to get him this vital piece of equipment. She says, "I fought the Magisterium, I enlisted the witches, I gathered the bears, and I've come all of this way. You're gonna take this thing, damn it." But Asriel doesn't agree, and he gives the alethiometer back to her and says, "Hey kid, it's yours. This is yours to keep." Lyra says, "You call yourself a father?" And Asriel says, "That's kind of the point here. I've never called myself a father." And they part ways. We then turn to one of the weirder, juicier scenes which of course involves Mrs. Coulter. We see Mrs. Coulter either scratching or pinching or torturing the golden monkey. It's really not clear what she's doing to him other than that he's reacting, and we can see whatever it is he's feeling mirrored on her own face. I think this scene showed us how Mrs. Coulter loves to live on that very fine division between pleasure and pain. Luckily, before this can go on for much longer, Father MacPhail interrupts her doing whatever it is she's doing to have a little chat with her and see where things are. After Mrs. Coulter expresses her uncertainty of the outcome of their mission with Lord Asriel, Father MacPhail seems very surprised and says, "We have firepower and belief." And Mrs. Coulter says, very derisively, "Two mighty weapons." Mrs. Coulter is definitely a soldier of the Magisterium herself, so it's kind of surprising to hear that she, for whatever reason, thinks that Asriel has any kind of advantage over them. Mrs. Coulter tells Father MacPhail that he seems quite afraid of Lord Asriel's work and that he doesn't seem like he wants to find out what Asriel has been working on. Hearing this, Father MacPhail comments to Mrs. Coulter on how much power Lord Asriel still has over her, and he kind of wonders aloud at how things got to be that way, how Lord Asriel trapped Mrs. Coulter in this strange relationship that they have where she both loves and hates him. He also implies that Lord Asriel derailed Mrs. Coulter's career, which of course Mrs. Coulter does not like hearing. She responds by this very defensively, saying that she wonders what Father MacPhail's sin is. She says everyone has a sin, and after dismissing lust and greed as Father MacPhail's sin, she lands on envy. She loves getting right up into his face. She tells Father MacPhail that he envies what both she, Mrs. Coulter, and Lord Asriel have, and that is the certainty of what they're doing. She says that he envies their conviction. These two are really reading each other in the cruelest of ways, and it is great fun to watch. Lord Boreal is back at the Magisterium to harass Fra Pavel, the Magisterium alethiometrist. He asks Fra Pavel what answers he's found to the question that Lord Boreal posed before about Stanislaus Grumman. Fra Pavel tells him that the alethiometer has conveyed that Stanislaus Grumman found an object. He found a knife in a tower surrounded by angels, and that Lord Boreal will be led to this tower by Stanislaus Grumman's son. Fra Pavel is pretty confused about this response from the alethiometer because as far as he knows, Grumman doesn't have a son, but Lord Boreal immediately understands the importance of this and realizes that the missing piece of his Grumman puzzle is actually Will Perry. Back at the lab, Lord Asriel tells Thorold that he is going to leave as soon as possible to go wrap up his experiment. He tells him that he's bouncing, and Thorold knows what's going on well enough to know that Lord Asriel is probably not going to come back. He asks Lord Asriel, "After all this time, you're not bringing me with you?" And Asriel says no, he needs Thorold to stay behind to look after Lyra and make sure that she's okay. This doesn't really track very well with Thorold, and we can see the frustration and resentment on his face. We can also see that Thorold doesn't necessarily agree with this decision. Thorold asks Asriel if he's at least going to say goodbye to Lyra, and Asriel's response is no, he has too much work to do so. He tells Thorold that he's going off not to pursue just the Magisterium, but to pursue the enemy. This is an interesting reference to Asriel's part in this whole story. Lord Asriel really is Satan or Lucifer in the story of Adam and Eve. He's the one tempting the world into understanding themselves, obtaining knowledge that is forbidden. If you are interested in learning more about that, I would really encourage anyone to read The Satanic Epic by Neil Forsyth. It really talks about Satan's role in Paradise Lost, and I think it is a great way to understand what Philip Pullman wanted to do with Asriel's character. In another part of the lab, Lyra is finally enjoying a nice hot bath, and we see Roger outside of the bathroom knock on the door. He really wants to talk to her and try to understand what's going on. Lyra is not excited to have a boy in the bathroom with her, even Roger, but Roger says that he will walk backwards and sit backwards so that there's no weirdness between them. And we see both him and his adorable demon do exactly that. This was one of the times that I really laughed. I thought it was so adorable and such a small detail, but so sweet. And we're reminded of how young these two are despite the terrible things that they've both witnessed. When Roger finally sits down, he confesses to Lyra that he's pretty worried about what's going on, and that when Lord Asriel looked at him earlier, he looked at him like he was a wolf or something. This is verbatim what Roger says in the book. And Roger has some kind of intuition that tells him that things are not right, that the fact that Asriel's mood changed completely when he saw Lyra and then saw Roger is a bad sign of something terrible to come, and he's not wrong. He's not wrong about this at all. He also talks to Lyra about what it's meant to him that they're both orphans and that they're orphans together, and that while Lyra is no longer technically an orphan, it might be easier for her to pretend that she still is. Roger says that parents are really more trouble than they're worth, but at least they have each other. We move to Will's world and we see Lord Boreal in the Perry house talking to the dark-haired, mustachioed private investigator over Thomas's literally dead body. He's asking the private investigator what exactly happened, how the private investigator could have let Will Perry go, and basically telling him he has royally fucked up. The private investigator is pretty offended by all of this, understandably, but is pretty keen to make the situation right. And when Boreal tells him that he needs to find Will, the private investigator takes this on and says that he will do his best. We also hear Boreal tell him to clean up the body. He doesn't even use Thomas's name because that's the kind of guy he is. And the private investigator tells him it's done. We then see the private investigator sitting in his car with a radio, and he puts out a semi-fake missing child report about Will Perry, posing as a police officer. He says, if anyone sees Will Perry, age 15, get in touch with me directly. And he's hoping that the local authorities can provide some information as to Will's whereabouts. Pretty smart move. Lyra and Roger share many tender moments throughout this episode, and one of those moments is watching them in a little fort they've built by the fireplace, eating what looks like to be a very not-so-great sandwich. Roger is talking to Lyra about how, if it had been up to him, he would have never left Jordan College, but that they're in such a different place, and they're only there because of each other. Lyra has really changed his life, but he's also changed hers, and he is at Lord Asriel's because Lyra brought him there, but Lyra only went north, in theory, to rescue Roger in the first place. So they are intertwined, their fates are bound together as far as Roger is concerned, and though things have gotten weird, he wouldn't have it any other way. After Roger has fallen asleep, and Lyra has too, Lord Asriel wakes Lyra up and summons her to talk to her about dust. This was one of my favorite scenes in the entire episode, and I think it's probably one of the most meaningful scenes in the series so far. We hear Lord Asriel talk about the meat and potatoes of his experiment and what it is that makes him so fascinated by dust. He tells us things that we've been needing to hear for quite some time to understand what exactly is going on. He says that the Magisterium thinks that dust is the physical, tangible evidence of original sin. And not only that, but that it is literally raining down from the sky, infecting us all with evil, which he concedes is a terrifying thought. He goes on to talk about the scene in Genesis when Eve eats the apple of the knowledge of good and evil that is prompted by Satan himself. And we find out that in this world, Eve's demon only settles into one specific shape after she eats the apple. So there's a distinct theological connection between Eve eating the apple and puberty, and that is the point when sin starts to collect. Asriel and Lyra recite that passage from Genesis together. They say, "Your eyes shall be opened, your demons shall assume their true form, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." Dust. I love this part of the story personally because I think it is exactly who Philip Pullman is to rewrite the Bible for his own story. I love that he has the gumption and the moxie to say, I will take one of the most well-known pieces of literature in the world and make it my own to serve my own purposes. So, great job, Philip Pullman. Asriel goes on to say that the Magisterium has spent literally centuries trying to convince us that we are guilty with the stain of this original sin. He says that dust is an elementary particle. It can be seen and measured, but it has become a means for the Magisterium and for the authority to control us as humans and to tell us that we are never going to be good enough, we're always going to be compromised, and essentially that we are born guilty. They use this as a tool to oppress us, to suppress knowledge, and to control us, and he's done with it. This is really the moment when it clicks into place for Lyra. By cutting away demons, Mrs. Coulter was trying to preserve our sinless souls. Asriel talks about how beautiful the connection is between a human and their demon, but he also adds that there is an immense release of energy when the two are severed from each other. This is something that Lyra notices, as well as the audience, of course, and is foreshadowing to what will happen a bit later on in the episode. Asriel then says, "What is the ultimate question here then?" And Lyra fills in that the question is, where does dust come from? Asriel says, we can see it, we can measure it, and that means that we can build a bridge to wherever that light is shining from. He wants to build a bridge into another world to go to look for dust's origin. He wants to understand it and potentially eliminate it if he can. Though that may be an exciting proposition for Asriel, Lyra herself seems very weary of the idea, and she says that she knows that she's done her piece, and she is out, she just wants to go home at this point. Asriel doesn't seem content with that answer from her, and he says, you know, the alethiometer works by dust. That is what is moving the alethiometer and giving you those answers that you need. Lyra has had no idea all this time that that's true. How could she? But she does seem very intrigued by that idea. Before they part for the evening, Asriel tells Lyra that while he didn't send for her, he is glad that she came to him. He says, you don't come from nothing, Lyra. You're the product of something extraordinary. And I think this is his way of assuring her that though she may have very complicated feelings towards both of her parents, and knowing that they've both failed her in so many different ways, that she is part of something bigger, and that the union between Lord Asriel and Mrs. Coulter was probably something significant. Lyra wakes up to the sound of the Magisterium Zeppelins drawing even closer to Asriel's lab, and she sees Thorold gathering all of these things very hastily. She asks him where Roger has gone, and Thorold begrudgingly tells her that Asriel has taken Roger up the mountain. Lyra knows that this is not a good thing, and she puts pieces together and realizes that Asriel is going to cut Roger from his demon. He's going to sever the two. That is the release of energy that he spoke about just earlier that same evening. She scrambles outside and she calls for Yurik, hoping that he's nearby and can help her. Luckily for her, he is. And as soon as he realizes that she's in distress, he comes and finds her and says, how can I help? She says she needs to get up that mountain, and Yurik says, get on my back, we're going right now. And he summons all of the bears that he has brought from the palace because he knows that the Magisterium is arriving very shortly. The Magisterium breaks into Asriel's lab, and Mrs. Coulter is very careful not to disturb anything. She tells Father MacPhail that there are probably traps everywhere, which I don't believe is true. We see the soldiers fan out, and Father MacPhail and Mrs. Coulter eventually find their way up to the main deck where Lord Asriel's telescope is set up. What we don't know is that Thorold is standing in the shadow right there, and as soon as they get pretty close, he takes the opportunity to hit Father MacPhail with his gun, and Father MacPhail passes out on the ground. Mrs. Coulter has Thorold's shotgun pointed at her, but she is not afraid of Thorold, and she takes a minute to look through Lord Asriel's telescope, trying to understand what it is he's working on and where he's gone. She knows Asriel very well, clearly, and she realizes he's gone to the mountain. It was great to see the relationship between Mrs. Coulter and Thorold because they are both so entangled with Asriel's life. Mrs. Coulter knows that Thorold won't hurt her despite the fact that she's having a gun pointed at her. She quickly takes control of the situation. She asks Thorold exactly what Asriel is planning to do, and she says, is he going to flood our world with sin and darkness? She knows that Thorold has absolutely no respect for the Magisterium, but the authority is something different. She refers to the authority as he who shines above us and lights the way. There's really a reverence in her, despite all of the Magisterium politics, for the authority and the greater thing that the Magisterium represents. And she knows that Thorold might not be in the same place, but she's betting that he does have a healthy respect and fear of the authority, and she's probably not wrong. Back in our world, we see Will in what looks like a coffee shop. He is actively avoiding the police in the area, and he is obsessively checking the local BBC News for Oxford. It's very subtle, but it seems like he's looking for news of Thomas's murder, and more importantly, his involvement with it. Asriel and Roger finally arrive at the mountain where Asriel has set up his experiment. We see Stelmaria and Roger's demon at the site, and we can also see that the Magisterium, Lyra and Yorick, and all of the Svalbard bears are very close on his heels. The Magisterium Zeppelins have finally arrived, and we get a peek inside, and we can see that all of the soldiers who are about to parachute down have bird demons. I loved that attention to detail between them, and as soon as the Magisterium sees that the armored bears are taking up a formation, Mrs. Coulter gives them the go-ahead to attack. Bullets are flying everywhere. We see a bear taken down by one of them, and Lyra is just trying to get out of the way. She is very scared. Yorick intervenes, knowing that this is going to take quite some time, and the one thing that they don't have at the moment is time. He says, "I will take you up the mountain, get on my back, let's do this quickly." And so they travel. Yorick takes Lyra as far as he possibly can until they get to the famous ice bridge. Yorick has been with Lyra through so many difficult things, and they've grown so close to each other. Lyra really sees Yorick as her protector, as possibly her father figure at this point. And the idea of leaving him and going forward is very scary for both of them, but she knows, as he does, that he will not get across this very thin piece of ice. He just weighs too much. So they say a very fond farewell, and it's a very touching moment, and we're not sure if they'll ever see each other again. Lyra struggles across this thin strip of ice with Pan leading the way, and it looks very scary. At the top of the mountain, Asriel takes his chance and he grabs Roger from behind and he stuffs Roger into one of the cages that he's built. Stelmaria grabs Roger's demon, Celcilia, I think her name is, and she stuffs her in the cage next to Roger's. And we understand at this point that Lyra is right. They are about to be severed. This is a very crude looking contraption, and I think Pan says that it looks very similar to what they saw at Bolvangar. Roger is screaming, knowing what is about to happen, saying that this is not right, that he wants Lyra, and it is such a sickening thing to see. We realize at this point that Lord Asriel really is not very different from Mrs. Coulter. They're coming at the same thing from different sides, but they're willing to take the same measures to get where they want to go. Asriel tells Roger that he's sorry that this is happening to him, but that there are always casualties in war, and make no mistake, this is a war. He has this kind of self-righteousness in his eyes when he tells Roger that this war will free humanity forever. He absolutely believes what he's selling. Asriel then severs Roger and Roger's demon Celcilia by pulling a blade down between them. I found this particularly brutal and particularly awful because it looked so hard for Asriel to do. Unlike the facility at Bolvangar where it was somewhat automated, Lord Asriel really has to mean it. He really has to go through the physical task of separating these two, and there has to be some kind of willing involvement in it. This was so deliberate. This was so difficult. It really took quite an effort, and he really meant it. When the blade finally reaches the bottom of the cages and Roger and Celcilia are severed from each other, Celcilia melts into essentially dust, and Roger slumps over on his side of the cage dead. This great white light erupts right at the spot, and it blows everyone back, except for Lord Asriel, mysteriously. We see Lyra, who had been climbing up the mountain and is watching this entire thing, fall back down the mountain and is completely stunned for quite some time. The Magisterium soldiers see this enormous, immense white light and are also pretty dazed by it, and we see Yorick Burnison viewing it as well. This white light is quite beautiful, but for however beautiful it is, it came from something so ugly, so wrong, and so morally repugnant. Mrs. Coulter finds Asriel standing by the bridge, and we can see the silhouette of her gun behind her. When she gets closer to Asriel as he's staring into this bright light. He turns around knowing that she's there, and he has his shotgun in his hand, pointed at her and theoretically ready to shoot. Mrs. Coulter tells him that the Magisterium will never allow this, and that while the experiment may be complete, they will never allow him to continue with this. Asriel scorns this idea and says that this is a done deed and that there is no more allowing. When everyone hears about what he's done there, this will be the end of the Magisterium. There will be no more oppression, there will be no more abuse, and there will be no more darkness. Asriel invites Mrs. Coulter to him and says, "Come feel the light of another world on your face. Feel this warmth. Stand here with me." And he says with the zeal of someone who truly believes, "Help me create a new Republic of Heaven." In case you don't want to wait for season 2 or season 3 to learn more about Lord Asriel's great project, the Republic of Heaven, you can read Philip Pullman's amazing essay by the same title, The Republic of Heaven. It is one of the best pieces of essay I have read about his Dark Materials, which makes sense since it's written by the author. But for me, this is almost the statement of purpose behind the entire series. Philip Pullman asks the question, what happens to the kingdom of heaven when the king dies? And that's really the question that is at the root of this story. So if you can get your paws on it, I would highly recommend reading this essay. I should tell you that it's from the Horn book, and it is from the 77th edition from December 2001. Asriel tells Mrs. Coulter that she can lie about the Magisterium, she can lie about the General Oblation Board, she can lie about Lyra, but the one thing she cannot lie about is her own ambition. Mrs. Coulter responds by saying that her place is with her daughter, and because her daughter is still in this world, she has to stay there. We see Mrs. Coulter and Lord Asriel kiss, and we can also see their demons kind of snuggling up against each other. I remember reading in the book that Lyra watches this whole thing go down, and she thinks to herself that it looks more like cruelty than love. Their demons aren't necessarily snuggling in the book as much as fighting with each other. They're roughhousing, and I thought that was very fitting. These two have such a complicated relationship that there can never just be one thing happening between them. Mrs. Coulter responds, this is Lord Asriel's path and he needs to follow it for himself, but she can't follow him as well. Back in Will's world, we see Will hiding from 2 police officers who are walking down the street towards him. He finds himself in a park very close to where we see Lord Boreal entering and exiting through the door in the air, and we know that the time has finally come. The scene changes, and Lyra is left with the wreckage of what has happened. She sees Roger's dead body, and she pulls him out of the cage while we see Pan poking his little face in the cage where Salsilia, Roger's demon, had been. The two of them are devastated. Lyra holds Roger's body and says to Pan that this is completely her fault, that they got everything wrong, and she realizes that all this time she'd actually been bringing Roger to his death. That is ostensibly why this episode is called Betrayal, and we might have the idea that this is when Lyra fulfills the prophecy that the Master of Jordan College spoke about in episode 1. If you've read the books, you know that might not be the case. As usual, Pan is the guiding light here, and he tells Lyra that all of the adults around them think that dust is bad, but maybe dust is something that isn't bad, and it is something that needs protecting. Maybe they can be the two who find dust and protect it. Lyra likes this idea, and perhaps because it gives her some purpose, perhaps because it is something good that can happen from something so bad, she takes up this idea and she says, if we can find dust before Asriel finds it, maybe we can do something important. We go back to Will's world and we see a cat walking in front of him. The cat meows, and I swear the cat is saying Will's name, and it's so cleverly done. It's really hard to tell whether the cat is speaking to Will or simply meowing or some kind of hybrid, and Will's ears perk up, as did my own cat. Will follows the cat through 2 twisted bars towards what looks like an opening in the air. In Lyra's world, we see her get very, very close to the bridge, and we know that they're both entering this at roughly the same time. Will sticks his hand into the window and he feels something that feels right and he goes in. Lyra on her end does the same, and she walks forward into the bridge of light. She has no idea where she's going or what she'll find, but she is stepping into a new adventure. The episode ends with us looking at the aftermath of what Azriel has done. We see this great white light, this bridge into another universe, but we also see Roger's dead body just laying there outside. Lyra doesn't know what to do with it, so she's left it where it is. We're left to question whether it was worth it all, whether Azriel's experiment, as potentially impactful as it was worth the death of an innocent child. And for me, this is what the episode was about. I usually end my episodes with parting thoughts, but to be honest, this episode left me with more parting questions than it did conclusions. The things that I wonder most about the show are, what is the meaning of the show? And is the meaning of the show something that I am projecting onto it because I have a rough understanding of what the books are about? Or is that different? Is the show something that I shouldn't be holding up to the books? Is it something that can really stand on its own? To be honest, I'm not entirely sure. I don't think that I have the objectivity to tell whether this is a good show aside from its source material, and I wish I did. I think the acting is great. I think most of the writing is really good. I just want it to be a little bit more substantial. And I think that the writers are doing the best job that they can, but I want some more grit. I want some more substance. And I am happy that we get this great opportunity to see this visionary work come to life in such loving and beautiful detail. I just want them to follow up with the real material behind it. So I am very excited about season 2, really looking forward to diving deeper into this world and seeing all of the new characters that emerge and finally getting to see Lyra and Will meet each other. I really want to thank you all for going on this journey with me these last 8 weeks, for watching my videos, for all of your incredibly thoughtful and insightful comments. I obviously love his dark materials very, very much, and I so appreciate your participation. For all of the family and friends I've made watch these videos, I see you and I appreciate you. I don't know that I will be posting any new videos until season 2 comes out, but feel free to check back here. I might do something about the Secret Commonwealth, which I'm still reading. I'm not quite sure, but I will definitely continue these videos with season 2. Again, thank you all so much and Happy New Year.